Alright, so last but not least in terms of components is the box itself, and recently found this Plano waterproof stowaway box on Amazon for about $3.50. It's a little cheaper if you buy them with their add-on plan, but generally it's about the best one I've ever seen in terms of being both cheap, see-through, which is highly useful for light detection and other projects, and just keeping track of the state that your logger's in, and just generally the right size is what I would say. I think it was designed for cell phones originally, but when you take a look at the components that we're using, and we just sort of plunk them in the box here, it ends up being more or less perfect for what we're trying to do. So we need to do a few modifications to this box as it ships, not really complicated ones. First thing to do, and forgive me for the cooking show trick here, but you want to add a couple of holes to the ribs on the back. This is just so that you have somewhere to attach zip ties to, so that you can suspend your logger in place. And another hole here, off the top of my head I can't remember exactly the size. I know I'm using the PG7 cable glands, which are really cheap on eBay, but you're going to have to drill a hole, and it's quite tricky actually, because you want to have it positioned so that the gland itself is allowed to spin so that it can tighten down on the back of that so that it can still be tightened onto the back of the housing. And so there has to be pretty good spacing. That's a hole that students might not be able to drill if they haven't had a lot of experience with a drill press or something like that. That's probably a bit tricky. And then, just because I have the tools available, I usually tap that out so that not only do I have the seal from the rubber, but I also have something like a seal based on the threads themselves.
So a tap is a bit that allows you to create threads, right?
Yeah, basically this is optional. You could just use the pressure on the O-ring on the cable gland, but I find that this just gives me a nicer snug fit.
And you just bought the tap on eBay?
I think I bought it used at a garage sale, really. This one, not that everyone's going to have the same size, but this one's listed as 12M175 on the thread size. It's not an exact match.
Show the head. The key thing is that's the part.
Yeah, but this doesn't actually match. It's just close. This isn't a perfect match for the thread on the cable gland. It's one of those situations where close enough is good enough.
Well, since you're working with soft plastic.
Exactly. So now I'm just going to shake the gunk out of this because I just threaded it in. But basically the idea is once the threads are tapped, you can tighten that down. You want to make sure that even if you're getting the cheapies off of eBay, you get the ones that come with the rubber washer, because it's really the compression of the washer that gives you your seal, and the quality variation is as extreme as anything else from eBay, so sometimes you get really crummy ones. The idea is that you squish the O-ring there, thread your connector on the other side. Just a little bit tricky. Again, it all hinges on getting the position of that hole correct, and it looks like I didn't quite do that here, so I'm going to have to unthread it from the outside and tighten it up. But the idea is, if you get that hole in the right place, you can get a cable gland on there with some reasonable amount of seal around that edge. So first modification is some holes in the ribs here just for zip tie. second modification on the housing is a hole just under the one corner so you can put a cable gland in. And the third one, which is also a little tricky, is I had to melt my way through some of these ribs just for a zip tie connector, and that's where I like to put the desiccant pack. So if you try and stuff the desiccant pack in at the bottom of the housing, it sort of floats around on you and can bump into things, but if you've got a zip tie point, you can zip tie the desiccant pack in and it'll stay in place. And so with an old soldering iron tip, obviously you wouldn't want to use a new one because you would ruin it for this, but you can get a little strap through there, and that gives you a point of attachment for a desiccant pack. So overall, I mean, this is really a nice little package to contain our components. There's a decent O-ring on these Plano stowaways. It's not great, but it's not terrible either, and there's a sort of ridge that provides you with your actual seal. And with those three modifications, you're good to go for, you're basically ready to start this sort of assembly and arrangement inside the housing. So let's move on to that. Let's do that with one of these boxes that's been prepped already. Alright, so once we have our housing ready, it's time to do our final assembly. And we've got our 4 components here to go in the box. And there's only one of these still needs a little bit of prep, and that's the battery connector. The battery connector here doesn't have any adhesive on it, and so I'm going to use the black adhesive again just because it works much better with plastic surfaces than the gray. The gray would still work for this if it's what you have, but if you have a choice between the 20-pound black and the gray, use the 20-pound on these battery connectors. The little mini breadboard that I use in these loggers has got an adhesive backing on it already. Now these adhesive backings are pretty notorious for being not the greatest. I'm going to put this in, but sometimes it's a good idea to just take the wax paper off the back and add in a second layer just to make sure that your breadboard stays in place, because sometimes these are pretty poor adhesives that they give you with these cheapy, I think these were 50 cents each. So I don't know if I trust that so much. It might be a good idea to just, let's do it, put some extra tape on that as well. Alright, so the first thing we'll put in there is the little SD board, or sorry, breadboard. Okay, positioning doesn't have to be super precise here, but what you want to do is you want to leave enough room that if a cable is coming in through your cable gland, that it doesn't crash into anything that's on this board. So, you know, having a nice finger width in there gives you room to play with those wires without having too much problem. The next item we're going to put into place is the battery connector, and you can see that there's a decent amount of sort of play here. In fact, you could put much larger. This is a AAA battery connector. Probably a set of 3 AAAs like this is only going to run this logger for, yeah, I'd say 2 to 3 months-ish, which is long enough for a student project. But if it was, you know, a deployment for doing longer environmental monitoring, you can always sort of slip one of these in. This is a 4 times AA, and you can easily get more than a year of life out of this much power, and that would slide in there as well. And so this is really just us choosing a battery connector that leaves us the freedom of doing a bit of noodling around on this breadboard, maybe adding a little debounce circuit if the student project involves a relay or some other circuit like a rain gauge that requires just a little bit of extra circuitry. They can always just add this so the wire can come in from the sensor, hit the breadboard, and then go along to the Arduino. And leaving the room for that sort of entails using a smaller battery connector. But again, on a student project, it's not too much of an issue. You still have months of operation.
For alignment, I mean, basically the left-hand side of that just goes to the left-hand side of the breadboard.
The alignment here is with the wires. You want the wires to come out and go over to your Arduino. So it's not really aligning on there per se. It looks a little better if it's lined up there, but the real issue is making sure you don't get the battery wires on the wrong side. And with these clear bottoms, you can kind of see where the tape is attached. And where it's not attached, you'll see these little air bubbles. So you want to try and get rid of your air bubbles if you can. Over time, this 20-pound black 3M tape will get stronger, but when you just attach it, it can be usually taken off if you've made a mistake. Alright, so there's the breadboard for doing a little bit of sensor additions and a bit of noodling around. There's the battery pack, and here's the partial logger stack that we created earlier. And all we have to do now is take off these rows of tape and stick it in. And in this, the way we've laid this out, we've got one cable gland here, but sometimes you have a need for more than one external sensor. So it's a good idea to leave this space inside the housing, the opposite corner, because you can stick a second cable gland on there. So I usually position this so, again, there's that finger's width of space should we decide to add a second exterior connector there. And so we can just pop this down.
You can also see the rib, the external rib that holds the lid on. You want it to be just lined up with that.
Yeah, there's a lot of freedom to play around here. I've got the UART connector on this side and the SD card here. And then the next thing is to bring these battery wires, and I usually pass them right under here, just through the logger itself, just for cable management sake. And the place where you're going to connect them is right here on these two screw terminals. So the water just wraps around, we trim it to length and tap it into there.
So you put the wires, the power and the ground wires from the battery underneath the Arduino board, which makes it awfully neat. Is there additional reasons for doing that?
No, it's just cable management.
Okay.
This is actually quite annoying here.
Yeah, nothing like doing something on camera.
Yeah, well, you know, the last 15 took no time whatsoever, and this one's just being annoying.
Yeah. this in.
You want to give them a tug just to make sure they're solidly in place.
Do you want to show what you mean by a tug?
Just pull on the wires to make sure that you haven't sort of somehow managed to route the wire in the wrong place so that it's...
Basically, you can't pull the wire out with the screwdriver.
Yeah, just a little check there. Okay. Alright, so there's our battery connector. So there's no actual power switch. The power switch on the way this is put together is literally just lift the battery out. That's your on-off switch, is putting the battery in. If you wanted to, you could easily just add a separate connector so that you have a disconnect. But again, in terms of simplifying the build, this works well enough for most cases. If you had a really twitchy sensor, you might need like a switch in the middle here so that you were actually having a more controlled power on-off event. And then the last piece that we're going to throw in here is our RTC board.
Real-time clock.
Yeah. And all of the connections from the RTC board go on to the digital side. And I mentioned earlier that we're going to use the D2 pin for the alarm. That's the blue wire here. And so just to get access to these pins, for now I'm just going to take the SD card out. And then we'll adhere this down and attach the RTC board. We've got a fair bit of excess wire, as you'll see when we trim these to length. It'll look much neater once it's in place. Alright, so ground wire goes to one of our ground connections. And you can see there's a lot of excess there, so same basic idea as when we were trimming those wires before. You leave about 5 millimeters, quarter of an inch longer than you think it needs to be, and that wire is the wire that goes into the actual screw terminal.
It's probably good not to make the wires too tight on the first builds.
Yeah, if you're doing this...
I mean, if it's a centimeter too long and you got floppy wires, you can always go back and shorten them up.
Mm-hmm.
The other way doesn't work so well.
No, the other way doesn't work at all. So.
Oh, I've had to put extension wires on wires.
Yeah, you can just solder a new...
and put some heat shrink on it.
Right.
It's not terminal.
There's our ground. The next one is this... the blue wire goes into D2, which is a little bit blocked the way we have our limit resistor on the LED. I probably should have left that out a bit, but we'll work our way around it.
And again, these wires are simply properly twisted and mechanically screwed down on. They're not tinned.
See, I gave myself a bit of a problem there. I can still work around it, but I should have left that leg on the resistor a bit longer so that it wasn't in the way. So you want this to be tight, but you want to make sure that you don't tighten it so much you break the connector off. It is possible to just reef on these things and have them snap. So it's kind of a...
That would be very unfortunate at this point.
That would be, yes, highly annoying at this
Your
point.
skeleton would be broken.
Mm-hmm. So the next one we bring around is the clock line.
Which is yellow.
And if you remember, that was the A5 connection that we added the extended pins off of the back side of that board. And so that goes to the third one from the end here.
Yep, the first one being a power line.
Yep, so there's our clock connection for the I2C bus. Next one is the data line from the I2C bus.
which is white.
Only because I use that color convention.
Working with students, though, I do pretty much insist that they do not use red and black for anything but for power and ground.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I use yellow for clocks and white for data. But
there's a lot of room for innovation and choice, but not so much with power and ground.
no, yeah, don't get those wrong. Although, having said that, I have seen sensors come from manufacturers with
crazy colors.
with red and black reassigned to some other thing. So again, you give a little tug just to make sure your connections are solid. And that's, I'm putting a pretty substantial pull on these, and they're all nice and tight, so just give it one last check. I find that occasionally a wire will get loose over time. There we are. Okay.
It's good to, because these are multi-strand wires as well, it's good to look visually, closely at the units. Make sure you don't have any stray wires.
Put our little SD card back in. Alright. So the next step is to take this little I2C connector here. This is a pass-through from the RTC, and bring it up to a set of wires and plug it into the breadboard so that you can attach a sensor there, because it's a bus, you basically daisy chain all the items along if you use the I2C bus. And so I usually add a set of wires here just to bring it up to the breadboard. Alright, now because this is a screw terminal, you don't have to do any soldering for this. You just strip the wires. And this is a smaller screw terminal board, so maybe 4 millimeters, a little bit less space than you would use for these larger connectors, because it's just not as deep. Oh, looks like it wasn't opened.
Do you need a smaller screwdriver for those?
No, they were closed, and I hadn't opened them before starting this, so here we are.
And these only have to be long enough to go to the breadboard within the housing.
Correct. So these guys are basically just going to go up here, and we'll put a DuPont connector, a DuPont male, just so we can plug it in with some confidence into that board.
It might be personal preference, but I mean, I would put the DuPont pins on the wires before putting them in the screw terminals. But
yeah,
it's choice.
I probably did it in the wrong order. You're right, that would have been probably better. Okay, so those are good and solid. And now we just bring them up. And I like to have enough cable so that you can attach it at any position along that breadboard, and then the wires just sort of naturally fold along the back there. And so just pulling them all so they're more or less the same length. We can trim off the excess here. Alright, so now we're going to crimp some DuPont connectors onto those. Again, this is solderless. Alright, so here's some DuPonts. Basically just cut a few off, and this is definitely an art. Some people never really bond with these crimpers. I like them. Again, there's two. You have to crimp everything twice with this model. There's various of these on the market, so this is sort of just the typical cheapie you get off of eBay. So the first crimp is the loose one, so you just sort of run it up against the edge. So crimp it in the big one first, and you want to make sure that you're getting the insulation under the first set of wings and the metal under the second set of wings. Give it another crimp. Again, there's tons of videos out there on crimping, so just make use of YouTube. It's not that hard after you've done it a few times, but the first few times you do crimping of these connectors can be a bit intimidating.
It's impressive. NASA is very much in favor of mechanical dry connections now.
They always have been. Soldering is too much chemistry that can go wrong.
Like many things, the actual material cost of the individual pieces is really minor. When you order these things, they come in batches of hundreds and thousands.
Yeah, I think it's about a penny each for these.
The crimper, though, is not inconsequential.
Yeah, $25. Same as the soldering iron. I use the crimper probably equally as much as I do, maybe not quite that much, but I use the crimper a lot. I consider it a required tool.
Heat shrink?
Yeah, for these individual connections, I prefer to use heat shrink rather than the plastic shrouds that they sell. Heat shrink gives you a bit more mechanical support on your wires.
Well, you have to do something because these contacts are right beside each other.
Yeah, you don't want anything contacting. But something else that I usually do is this is about 1/16 ish mil spec. Mil spec heat shrink becomes hard when it's melted, whereas normal heat shrink retains flexibility. But I like this one because it gives it a little bit more protection there where the pinch point would normally be. So I tend to use this mil spec stuff because it's thicker and harder.
The pinch point being right where the wires can be flexed back and forth every time it gets used or the lid gets closed.
Yeah.
And so if that happens too much, you can actually break the wire inside its insulation.
Oh yes, and that is highly annoying. And that happens to me all the time, actually. My wires are broken only on the inside. Alright, so this is still a little warm there, but now we can sort of add a tap point here wherever we choose. Okay. So the other nice thing about these plano boxes is that there's plenty of room there for that wire without pinching anything, even with those DuPont connectors in place. There's no pinching going on. That's still lots of room. Alright, so the next component to add is the exterior connector. And again, this is assuming that you'll be bringing in a sensor from the outside world. If you just wanted to add a regular sensor, this is an I2C sensor. This is just a pressure sensor, but to attach it to the bus, all we have to do is plug that in there, and so now that I2C sensor is connected through these wires, through the RTC, back to the Arduino. And if we move it down a little bit, leave an extra row, we could bring another set of wires in from the outside and connect it right there as well. So depending on how your sensor arrangement works, you can you could just leave the cable gland out. That's rare for the student projects that we usually see, but you could just do that and have your sensor connected.